Hi, welcome to this video. Today we will be configuring the AWS SDK for SAP ABAP. In the previous video, we installed the AWS SDK in our SAP system by importing the transports. And this is all part of a wider series on how to use the AWS SDK in wrap apps for OCR and document storage with Textract and S3. Now, all the links to the materials we'll be using today will be in the video description, including a link to how to install the AWS for SAP if you haven't done so already. Today, I'll be running through a blog on the AWS website. This blog is really good and will take us through the steps required to configure the SDK. Now, there are some prerequisites. You do need a SAP NetWeaver system of 7.4 or above. I'm using a Docker system. These instructions won't work for a BTP ABAP system. And if you are running your SAP system in AWS, although this video will be helpful, the authentication mechanism for workloads on AWS is different. So you will not have a working or finished configuration at the end of this video if you are running your SAP system in AWS, but you'll still find this video helpful. Now, I'm assuming you already have an AWS account, but you do not need an S3 bucket or an IAM role, as I will run you through how to do this. I am assuming you have the required authorizations in your SAP system. If you are in a Docker system, you should already have the authorizations. And if you don't, you can click this link, and these are the authorizations that you will need. So let's get started. We can skip the transport steps as we have done that already. And so there's 4 areas we're going to need to configure: the technical prerequisites, the global settings, the application configuration, and the runtime settings. So let's get into it and input this transaction code /n/AWSS1/IMG into our transaction bar. And let's expand the technical prerequisites setting. And you'll see here there is help for all of these settings, and the help is quite useful. So this one is saying we need to set a profile parameter. So this profile parameter needs to be true. And so let's go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to go /o rz11 and put in that parameter name and display. And you can see in my system it's true, and you'll need to check in yours if it's true, and you'll need to change it otherwise. So we can close that window. Okay. Now we do need to import the AWS certificates into our SAP system. And this will this is so our SAP system trusts the Amazon certificates. So what we need to do, we need to click this link, and we need to download certificates 1, 2, 3, and 4, and just press this DER to download the certificate. So download all 4, and then hit back. Okay, so it's saying expand technical prerequisites node. Okay, we set that to true. Download the certificates, and we need to import them into the SSL client standard. You need to make sure they don't already exist. So let's just go down. And so let's expand this. It's this client certificate standard. Let's expand that. And these are all the different certificates that are in there, and you can see there's no AWS certificates. So let's go change mode. Let's go certificate and import. And I am going to import, just so I can remember, that CA1 first. Hit the tick, press allow, scroll down, and go add to certificate list. And we can see here it's added, and we need to do this for all 4. Allow, always remember, add to certificate list, import, add to certificate list, press save, and you can see all 4 are there, and we can hit back. So if the SAP system is running in a location other than AWS, we need to do these steps. And so my system's a local system, so I need to do these steps. And this is all about using SAP's secure store and forward mechanism to encrypt the credentials that we are going to put in here to be able to authenticate with AWS. So let's see what we need to do. So for on-premise systems only or systems running in other clouds, so we need to go to SE16, we need to go to SSF app LIC, create a new application called AWS1, and put an X in all the fields. So let's do that now. SE16. Sorry. New AWS1 and put an X in all of these fields. And we need to enter a description, and the description was SSF encryption for AWS SDK for SAP ABAP, and we can press save. Okay, that step is done. And here's a screenshot. So we've done this. Okay, now we need to set the encryption parameters. So we can do that by clicking Set SSF Parameters. And it's telling us we need to pick SHA-256 and encryption algorithm AES-256. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. And new entries. We need to pick the application we just created and press enter. Okay, so everything stays the same apart from the hash algorithm and the encryption algorithm, and then press save. Go back, save again for good measure, it's already saved. Okay. Now we need to create a PSE, so that's personal security environment for the SSF application. And so we can do that by going to strust, but we can click tick here. And you see here that here is our SSF application, and we can go into change mode, right click and press create, and the default settings are fine. And that's saved for us, and you can see now that it's no longer crossed. So we can go back. Now we need to tell the AWS SDK which SSF application to use. And so let's go and do that now. And let's go new entry, And the SSF application is the one we've just created. So Z AWS 1. Press save and go back. Okay. Now we can do some global settings. So let's minimize the technical prerequisites and go to global settings. And let's read a little bit about scenarios. So you can define scenarios for your standard operation, disaster recovery, and DR drills. And you only need the default scenario, but you can create other scenarios and you can swap between scenarios. And so imagine if your default operations were in US East and some disaster happened and you needed to swap to US West. Well, you can change the scenario, the configured scenario. So you'll use resources in that other region. Now we're just going to configure default for now, but I think at the end of the video, I will configure some other scenarios and show you more about this. But we're just going to create a default scenario now for normal operation. So let's go ahead and configure scenarios. We'll go new, and we want default, and we'll just call this normal operations and press save and go back. Okay. So now it's saying the default scenario that you created must be set as in the active scenario. So we need to go to runtime settings and select active scenario. And the new scenario is the default scenario, and we set commit scenario change and press yes. And so in the event that we did need to, if there was some disaster and we needed to swap to our disaster recovery scenario, and you'd configured it, you could select it here and hit commit. Okay, let's close this runtime settings for now. Okay, so then there is configure AWS global configurations by going to global settings and technical settings. So let's go ahead and do that and click new entries. And so it's saying S3 regionalization. There's a specific setting for US East buckets, and we're just going to follow the instructions and say it's going to be via here. This isn't saying you're going to be using US East 1, it's just a specific setting for US East. And then STS. So STS is the global endpoint for AWS security token service. So we want to access STS via the global endpoint. And the meta endpoint mode, we want to use IP4 and press save. Okay, well, let's go back. Now we can configure an application, and we do this via SDK profiles. Now, an SDK profile, you should define an SDK profile for each application, and each application is like a use case. So if for our example, I'm creating a wrap application for loading invoices to S3, so I'm going to have a SDK profile called Z invoice, and a profile tells SAP how to authenticate with AWS, what IAM role to use, and the default region for the scenario. So, and we'll come back to this, the rest of this, because this is useful information here. But what we'll do is let's define an SDK profile. So I'm going to hit new entries, and my profile is going to be called Z invoice, and it's going to be invoice processing app. And then we go to authentication and settings. So we'll tick this and authentication and settings. And let's press new entries. Now, in the instructions earlier, it was saying you configure everything. You configure, so the SID for A4H and the client I'm using is 1, and the scenario myself is default. But if you're in, say, a dev, test, prod type landscape, you'd configure everything in dev. So you'd have your dev SID, and then you'd create a new entry for your test SID, and the same for your production SID. And then you transport everything into production. Now, the SDK is going to use the SID to determine which configuration to use. But the advantage of doing it in dev and transporting everything through to production is that in the event of a system refresh from prod to dev, all your dev configuration will still be there, and your dev system won't inadvertently use your production configuration. And so this here is where we need to actually go to S3 to do the configuration. So let's go ahead and go to S3 now. Now, I think I might expand this like this. Okay, so what do we need? Well, in our scenario, we need an S3 bucket to store invoices. So let's go to S3. You can type S3 up in the console and open it that way too. And we need to create a bucket. So let's go ahead and create a bucket. Now, bucket names are globally unique. So that means it's not unique to yourself or your account. It's in the global namespace. So you need to come up with a unique name here. And this is going to be important as well when we talk about logical resource names. But let's go ahead and create a bucket. I'm going to put A4H. I think it has to be lowercase, A4H invoice S3 bucket. Hopefully that's unique, and we'll leave all other settings to be the same. Now, my AWS region is AP Southeast 2, and you can change the default region from here. So I'm going to copy this because this is our first piece of information in saying, well, what region are you operating in? And I'm going to put that AP Southeast 2. So I'm going to go and create this, and then you can just hit create bucket. Now, if I wanted to create a bucket, say in Singapore, I could go Singapore here. And create bucket. And you can see here that the region has been set, but I don't want to do that. I'll go back to Sydney. Okay, now I think what we'll do is let's open up a notepad and just store some information. So go back into the bucket we created. So this one is which one I created, and go properties and see this Amazon resource name. Copy that, and let's just go S3 and put that there. We'll just save that for later. Okay. Next step is we need to create a user because we need some credentials for SAP to authenticate to. So to do that, we want to go to I am, and let's go like this. Okay, let's go users, and let's create a user. We need to create a username. I'm going to call it SAP underscore A4H invoice service, and hit We don't want to provide access to the console and hit next. And we're going to select attach policies directly, and we're just going to hit next. And it's a review and create, and let's just hit create user. And go into the user, click into the user we created, and go security credentials. And here we define some access keys. So let's go create access key. And we want to select application running outside of AWS and hit next. We just enter a description, so we'll call it A4H keys and click create key. And you want to copy this access key as well. And you don't want to store this after we have configured it. Okay. And then press done. Continue with that. We've copied it, so let's just go continue. Okay. Now let's go back to our application and select the authentication method. And here we want to say credentials from SSF storage. Now, if you're running your application in AWS, you would select instance role via metadata, but we're selecting credentials from SSF storage and press enter. And after pressing enter, this set credentials button has come up. And we need to save the profile. So let's just press save. Okay. And then let's select set credentials. And this is where we enter that access key that we configured earlier. And our secret key. So this is what we've just taken from the AWS website and hit the green tick. And the credentials have been stored, and we can hit save. Now we've created a user, but the user has no permissions, or it can't do anything. So if we go to the next step, which is IAM role mapping, and create new, we'll just put this in the first sequence. It's asking for an IAM role. So we need to create a role, and we need to allow our user to assume the role. And the role is a set of permissions, and those permissions are going to be, you're allowed to access the S3 bucket we've created. Before we go off and create the role, copy this ARN for the user and place it in the text file that we've been storing things. Let's just put user. So before we create a role, we'll create a policy. So select policy on the left-hand side, and a policy is an object in AWS that defines permissions. So go ahead and hit create policy. Now let's use this visual editor, and we're going to select a service, and we're selecting S3. And here are all the different actions that we could grant access to. So we could grant to everything. However, we're going to only provide it access to what it needs. So in list, let's select list bucket. So if by going info, this grants permission to list some or all of the objects in an AWS S3 bucket. So we want that. We want to be able to read individual objects. So let's maximize. So that's get object. And for write, we want to be able to put an object and delete objects. So we found delete and put. And finally, in tagging, we want to put object tagging, and we want to be able to delete object tagging. Now here, do we allow this policy is for this set of permissions, and now we need to select some resources. We could allow for all S3 resources, but let's be specific and only allow it for the S3 bucket we created. So we want to copy the S3 SRN, put that in there, and hit add. And we want to add some more permissions. In this one, we want to add text extract, and we need analyze expense, and press next. Now policies need a name, so let's call it SAP underscore invoice policy. And hit create. Okay, the policy is now being created. So now let's go and create a role. So select roles on the left-hand side and hit create role. Now we want to create a custom trust policy. And in here, we can now allow our user to assume this role. So in the principal, we can go add principal. We want to add an IAM user, and this is where we paste in the ARN for our user that we created earlier. Put that there and go add principal. Excellent. So now this user, we've creating a role, and we're saying this user can assume the role, and hit next. But the role as it stands doesn't have any permissions, and we can now add our policy that we just created. So let's go ahead and add that and select next. And the role needs a name, so let's call it SAP invoice role and select create role. And let's go have a look at this role. Looks like our policy wasn't added, so let's just go attach that policy again. Need to tick it and hit add permissions. Excellent, so that's there now. Okay, and we once again need to copy this ARN. And let's go back to our S3 bucket. And let's just remind ourselves that we've got that one invoice in there. Okay. So now we can expand our SAP. Now we paste in the role that we created, and it just needs a logical name. This could be anything, but we're going to call it, so a procurement officer uses our app, so let's put in proc off and press save. Excellent. So our SDK profile is now created. Go back on that. Now the last thing is setting up a logical resource. Now in these are like logical files. So if you remember before, S3 bucket names are globally unique. So you cannot have the same S3 bucket name in different AWS accounts. So you can't have the same bucket name for dev, test, and prod. So you want to use logical resources. So then you're not doing things in your code like saying if it's dev, use this bucket, if it's tested, it's this bucket, and prod in this bucket. So you can use logical resources to do this. So let's go ahead and create a new entry. I'm going to call mine Z invoice bucket and just give it a description of invoice bucket. And then you can go physical resource mapping, tick physical resource, and go new entries. And so this is once again something you would configure in dev for dev, test, and prod, and then the SDK would, based on the SID, look up the resource to use, and that then means with refreshes it doesn't get lost. And then you select a scenario. We're using default and our bucket name, so we want to go back to S3, copy our bucket name, and put that in the physical resource and press save. Okay, so now let's go back to the blog and take a look at the last step. And the last step is create this test ABAP program. And so it's called ZDemo S3 list buckets. And we're just going to use SE38. You could use Eclipse too, but we've already got the GUI open. And so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's copy this code and jump over to our SAP and go to SE38. And we're going to create this program. Just call it S3 test. Executable test program, save. And I'm just going to create a local object, never transport it through. Okay, and let's paste in our code and let's take a look, see what it's saying. So as a parameter, it's saying we'll pass in a logical resource. So the logical resource we just created was zinvoice underscore bucket. And then it's saying what SDK profile should I use? So we created zinvoice. And so you can see here by using the logical resource, we're not putting in S3 bucket names in our ABAP code that is going to change from dev, test, and prod. So that's the advantage of using the logical resource as well as the SDK profile where the authentication, the keys and stuff will change as well. So let's go ahead and activate that and press F8 and we'll run it. So if it's successful, it should show, we'll go and hit the tick. If it's successful, it should show invoice 1, and it does. And that means the SDK has been successfully configured. As you can see, we've successfully configured the SDK. Now I'd like to talk about the scenarios in more detail and some tracing and logging that you can do. If we go back to the SDK configuration, we briefly touched upon the scenarios. So configure scenarios. And we could see with the different scenarios how you could configure them and you could change the scenarios. So if there was some kind of disaster, you could potentially swap to a different region. And so I thought we would configure, say, DR main to use during an actual disaster, and you could see how that could work. So let's go ahead and go DR main and go ahead and configure that and go new, and we'll call that DR main DR scenario and press save. Excellent. So we can go back. Let's look at the SDK profile. So you can see the SDK profile is scenario specific. But first, let's take a look at our S3 bucket here. And you can see in the properties, it's in the Asia Pacific Sydney region. Now let's say we don't want our DR scenario to be in Sydney too. So let's go back and create a bucket to be used in our DR scenario in a completely different region. So let's change our region to Singapore. It's fairly close. and create a bucket. And we'll call that invoice bucket DR. And you can see that's in Singapore. And let's hit create. Excellent. So what we want to do is let's create a new authentication and settings line item. And it's going to be for A4H again, same client, but the scenario this time is going to be DR main. And the AWS region is AP Southeast 1, straight from the bucket there. And the authentication method is credentials still. I think we have to save that first. Go set credentials, and we will copy the same credentials and save those. Okay, and then we can go to the IAM role. And once again, we can reuse the role. And I'm going to have to go back to IAM and copy the role. So let's copy that in there. But some of you might have realized that our policy was quite restrictive, so we need to go add in our new bucket into that policy too. So let's just press save for now. I think I'm going to have to go back to S3 and get the ARN of our DR bucket. Let's just make that bigger for a second. This one, and go properties, and we can select the ARN for our DR bucket, and we can go back to IAM. And let's go policies. This is our SAP invoice policy. And click S3 and hit edit. Okay, and in the resource here, we want to add a resource. And we can paste in our DR bucket, and you can see it's added here. So these operations can be done on these two buckets, and hit next and save your changes. So the next step is we need to adjust our logical resource. So our invoice bucket will also change based on the scenario. So the scenario this time is DR main, and we need to put in the name of our S3 bucket. So let's go back to S3 and let's go to DR and copy this in and press save. And while we're at it, we want to upload a new file, but give it a different file to the one you added previously, or maybe just even add in two, and press upload. Okay, so now let's save this. Let's go to SE38, and in our normal operations, because we're still using our default scenario, if we run this, it's still pointing to our original bucket and showing one resource. Now let's say something happened to the Sydney region and we needed to swap to our DR scenario. We would go down to runtime settings and go to active scenario and change to DR main and hit commit scenario. and we'd say yes. We can now go to SE38 and run this. And you can see that it's pulled in the invoices from our DR bucket. And so that is without changing any of the ABAP code because it was all configuration. And so we can activate logging by, in the configuration, going to log and trace. By default, it's no trace, but we could turn on API calls and press save. Now, when we perform operations, it will log to a file, and I've discovered that that file in my Docker system, and I imagine it will be similar to your SAP system, it goes into the user file, SAP, the SID, so in my case A4H, D00, and then into the work directory. So dir work is what the AWS documentation says, but there's no log here because we've just turned it on. So let's go ahead and do some operations and run our program. Okay, let's go back to Docker. And you can see this AWS tracelog file now exists. So let's go have a look at that. And you can see that it has done a GET request on our S3 bucket in that AP South 1 region, which is our DR scenario that's currently configured. And so that is how you can do some tracing. Just don't forget to turn the trace off. Now, the final thing I'd like to show you is logging. So that's it for this video. If you found this content useful, please like and subscribe. And if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments below. In our next video, we will be starting the RAP application to store invoices in S3. So I hope you come along on the journey. Thank you.